Good morning. My name is Paul Leon. I'm the CEO of Illumination Foundation. Welcome back to day 3 of Virtual Homeless Consortium, Together We Can, expanding the conversations surrounding homelessness and vulnerable populations. Today's theme is analyzing the disparities in our systems. I want to thank our speakers from yesterday, Dr. Bronstein, Megan McClare, Pooja Bala, Veronica Stevens, Dr. Clayton Chow, Dr. O'Connell, and Tracy Kidder for taking the time to talk to us about health, wellness, and the most vulnerable. The recordings from day 1 and 2 are available on Together We Can website. Thank you again to our sponsors who have helped make this event possible and free of charge for all attendees. Anthem Blue Cross, Kaiser Permanente, Western University of Health Sciences, the Haynes Fund, Rick and Tammy Hortzman, Jacqueline DuPont and Mark Carlson, Howard and Ellen Merowitz, Alzheimer Orange County, Assured Home Care, Rhonda and John Grund, and Cal Optima. Thank you again to all of our speakers for sharing their expertise and their time. Today's topics include existing disparities in education and healthcare, the barriers to social justice, and finally, a message of hope from Father Greg Boyle of Homeboys Industries. You won't want to miss any of these breakouts. We would like for this event to be interactive as possible. We encourage you to submit questions by emailing news@ifhomeless.org. Once again, it's news@ifhomeless.org. We will be sure to address as many of your questions as possible in the live Q&A portion following each session. So without further ado, let's hear from our speakers. Be sure to stick around for live question and answers of each of these experts.
It is my pleasure to be here with you this morning and speak with you about a topic that is dear to my heart, which is the health and well-being of all children. I'd like to speak to you this morning about what I've called connecting the dots, adversity and the achievement gap, the impact of race and poverty. My name is Geeta Grover. I'm a developmental and behavioral pediatrician at the Center for Autism and Neurodevelopmental Disorders. I'm also a professor of pediatrics at the University of California, Irvine, and I have the distinct pleasure also to serve on the board of directors of the Illumination Foundation. So sadly, children are the poorest demographic in America today. They represent 23% of the US population, but comprise 32% of all people in poverty. Nearly 70% of children living in poverty are children of color, with 1 in 3 Black children and 1 in 4 Hispanic children and 1 in 11 white children living in poverty. Majority of these children live with at least one working family member, and a third of them live with a family member that worked year-round and full-time. So today, 1 in 6 children in America are living in poverty. As a pediatrician, it saddens me that for the first time, the American Academy of Pediatrics is now recommending that pediatricians routinely screen all children for poverty. Race is another issue we must tackle and talk about. Inherited disadvantage is the intergenerational accumulation of social disadvantage across generations that has left children and communities of color especially vulnerable, such that avoiding conversations about race today is really a privilege. Black and white children fare very differently in America, even when they grew up in homes of comparable income, education, and wealth. There are some elegant studies about this. As a pediatrician, I'm alarmed to learn that 1 of every 2 Black children have had a Child Protective Services investigation by the age of 18. Given that the vast majority of these investigations are for neglect, and vast majority of the reasons that these investigations are begun is because of the neglect or the presumed neglect that may come with poverty. It is extremely, extremely important that all of us be attuned to the idea that there is a difference between poor parenting versus parenting while poor. No longer can we ignore racism or racist practices here in our society because it has become very much a part of the fabric of our society today. Whether we're talking about institutional racism as a driver of homelessness, whether we're talking about confronting biases in our schools, or the generations of children that are being left behind by the inequities in access to education, or whether we're talking about racial profiling, as we've been seeing recently in our pandemic around Asian Americans. It is time that America must change and have the difficult conversations. So let us begin with the problems. Number 1, I would argue that today in America, inequity begins at birth. The zip code a child is born in may be more important than their genetic code and contribute to inequities in access to food, housing, and knowledge. When we look at wealth, there is a vast wealth inequality in this country. For every $1 earned by the median white household in 2018, the median Hispanic household earned just 73 cents, and the median Black household earned only 59 cents. When we look at the idea of inequity with regard to housing, 2.5 million children in America are homeless each year, representing 1 in every 30 children. That's almost 1 child in every classroom. The pandemic has only exacerbated inequities. For the 54,000 families, including 8,000 children experiencing homelessness on any given night in the United States, the ability to practice social distancing has truly become a social determinant of health during this crisis. Because public health measures require a level of privilege, a home to live in, access to hygiene supplies, ability to stay home from work, ability to avoid public transportation. And these are all things that unstably housed children and families are unable to access, increasing their risk. Continuing along the theme of inequity, there's an inequity with words. Lower income children, we know, hear fewer words and fewer different words than those growing up in higher income homes, such that by the age of 4 years of age, the differences in word exposure between children in higher socioeconomic homes versus those living in lower socioeconomic homes may be up to 30 million words. So more recent studies that have replicated this original study using a digital recording device, thereby eliminating that racial dissonance, have now recorded a 4 million word gap. So regardless of how you look at it, there is a huge inequity in words, whether you are in the highest socioeconomic strata or in the lowest. So I would argue that educational attainment is the single greatest protective factor against a lifetime of poverty. We know that children from low-income homes hear fewer words. They know fewer words by age 3. They have fewer literacy resources within the home. They're less likely to be read to regularly and more likely to experience childhood adversity and toxic stress than children that come from more advantaged families, all resulting in a significant learning disadvantage even before they have access to early preschool interventions. I would further argue that this process we call dropping out begins long before high school, because we know that brains are built over time. It is this critical interaction between genes and experiences that literally shape the architecture of the developing brain. For too many children, the process continues into middle school because of a loss of interest that is often triggered by grade retention. In a great many cases, this is then the result of not being able to read proficiently as early as 4th grade. The Department of Justice has acknowledged this and stated that the link between academic failure, delinquency, violence, and crime is welded to reading failure. All of this then results in what I'm calling the repeating cycles of underachievement, poverty, and homelessness. Those without adequate levels of literacy for economic self-sufficiency are at far greater risk for poverty and criminality. 70% of incarcerated adults cannot read at a 4th grade level, meaning that they lack the reading skills to navigate many of the everyday tasks or hold down anything but the lowest paying jobs. This statistic is one that takes my breath away as a pediatrician. 85% of juveniles who interface with the juvenile court system are functionally illiterate or low literate. What this says to me is that all of us, whether we are the parents, the educators, the pediatricians, know that low-income parents are less likely to be able to work from home and more likely to have difficulty arranging childcare, all leading to very difficult choices for them.
is my honor
It is
to
my
join
pleasure
this
to be here
august
with you
group
this morning.
serving some of the most vulnerable populations in America. 30 years ago, I was inspired to make my life's work helping children of incarcerated parents and children with multiple risk factors find paths to brighter futures. I feel privileged to say that over these decades, I've been blessed to carry out work that has demonstrated that mentoring, tutoring, character building, and visions of success actually free children of bitterness and resentment and place them on paths to achievement and success. Two important principles have inspired me. They've guided me. The first, every 10,000 children we keep out of the juvenile justice system saves our nation $1.5 billion annually. And it adds even more to this nation's economy, community, and productivity. The second principle, as Frederick Douglass once said, it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. The organization I founded, the U.S. Dream Academy, has been mentoring, equipping, and tutoring youth to help prevent delinquency and reduce violent crime. The results have been remarkable. In 2009, the Dream Academy led a violence reduction strategy initiative backed by DOJ in Ward 6 in Washington, D.C. In a final report, according to the local police precinct, it showed a 33% reduction in violent crime during the time of our active engagement. The strategy, led by the Dream Academy, had tremendous impact in just 1 year. It was clear that our work eased the burden on law enforcement, and we continue to build on the efficacy and success shown in the work we did there in Washington, D.C. Over the years, we have learned that children and youth exposed to violence, either as victims, witnesses, or offenders, that they are impacted in several negative ways, which may have a lasting impact on both the individuals involved and the communities in which they reside. Our research has found that a complex combination of individual relationship, community, and societal factors contribute to the risk of youth delinquency and violence. Both the impact and the source of youth violence is broad, and that means the solutions to address them must be equally multifaceted. When I founded the U.S. Dream Academy, I had no idea we would be giving national leadership and shining such a bright light on innocent young people hardest hit by the impact of violence, crime, and incarceration in our country. Our program is built on the pillars of tutoring, mentoring, and character building. We found the very up-close and personal ways our young people have encountered the police in their communities, either by witnessing the arrest of a parent in their home or seeing their parent brought into a courtroom, handcuffed with guns nearby. These images conjure up fear and distrust, but they must and can be combated with caring mentors, character building, academic tutoring, and new opportunities for growth and support. When we as a community provide the right preventative tools, the right structure, it improves the physical and emotional well-being of young people. Today, it is estimated that millions of young people are growing up in environments defined by economic adversity, peer difficulties, family stress, academic challenges, problem behavior, and mental health concerns. And it is estimated that more than 5 million youth under 18 have had at least one parent in prison at one time or another. And that leads to an adverse childhood experience that is distinguished by the unique combination of trauma, shame, stigma, and developmental disruptions. There's a phenomenon I have coined. I call it the normalization of incarceration. That's when brother and sister and uncle are in and out of jail. You know, there's an unspoken expectation that is created in the mind of a child that their experience will be my experience, and it will just a matter of time when I will have to go through that same rite of passage that they went through, and I too will end up incarcerated. The impact of that kind of family disruption, we have found, can last way beyond the period of parental incarceration. All these factors combined can increase a child's risk for future incarceration, especially when they have a parent who is incarcerated. Mentoring is an effective strategy to mitigate challenges facing these young people and contributes to improvements in behavior, relationships, and emotional well-being. The COVID-19 crisis and the sudden closure of schools in March of 2020 forced us to accelerate a virtual mentoring and after-school program delivery strategy to maintain vital relationships with our dream kids, dream teens, and parent givers during these school closures. We utilize free platforms such as Zoom and Google Hangouts to support video conferencing and mentoring sessions. In today's world, fighting a global pandemic and social distancing will require youth organizations to radically shift their delivery models to ensure those most vulnerable will still have access to mentoring and other wraparound services to support positive youth development. Constantly evolving technology, along with visionary ways to use it, will rapidly position virtual mentoring as a viable, scalable option. The Dream Academy has been asked to provide leadership in researching the efficacy of virtual mentoring amongst high-risk populations, and it is our goal to conduct valuable research in the field of virtual mentoring. We will be using technology to remove barriers to high-quality mentoring that existed pre-pandemic and face the new yet unknown challenges that may exist post-pandemic. We believe that the virtual mentoring model can reduce barriers associated with in-person meetings and address the issues of limited mentor availability and allow greater flexibility in choosing a mentor that meets the needs of a mentee. Today's youth are familiar with web-based communication and the high penetration of cell phones and popularity of social media, and that suggests that virtual mentoring is not only feasible, but may be preferred for many young people. My name is Wintley Phipps, President and founder of the U.S. Dream Academy. Thank you for giving me a few moments of your time today.
Good morning and welcome back. We're so glad that you can join us, and I really hope you loved all the videos. Unfortunately, Dr. Candace Taylor Lucas is not able to join us today. As you know, in Southern California, we're plagued by fires and we're in evacuation orders in some areas. And unfortunately, Dr. Candace Lucas has to evacuate. But I'm so happy to welcome Mr. Whitley Phipps, who is a friend of mine, and we were blessed to have won the Purpose Prize with AARP, and I was so inspired to meet him, and I'm sure you're going to be inspired. And we can take this now time to talk to the founder and CEO of US Dream Academy. And thank you so much for joining us.
Sure.
We're already getting questions coming in for you, and we have, I know when I first met you, I knew and learned about Dream Academy, but I also learned about this incredible gift you were blessed with, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I
Sure.
want to get right into some of the questions because I will try to get as many as we can. But number one is that you mentioned that you were inspired more than 30 years ago to form the US Dream Academy. What was the source and the inspiration that led you to just start the organization?
Sure. When I tell you the story, you're not going to believe it. I was actually on an Amtrak train from Baltimore to Philadelphia over 30 years ago. On Amtrak, when you don't want somebody sitting next to you, you learn how to camp out. And you put your food and your papers all around you, and you send the message, please find someplace else to sit. Well, I got on the train and I saw this man had camped out, but I looked into his eyes and he looked really low and discouraged. And there were other seats available, but I walked up to him. I said, is anybody sitting next to you? And he smiled. He said, no. And he pulled up his papers and everything. That man's name was Chuck Colson, who went to prison for the Watergate scandal. He was really known as President Nixon's hatchet man. Had actually planned another break-in before the Watergate break-in that didn't go well. And while in prison, he had a life-changing experience. And he decided that he was going to come out and spend the rest of his professional life helping prisoners and their families. This man, who could have been a lobbyist, who could have been making a lot of money and doing a lot of other things, being so close to President Nixon, spent the rest of his life, and I sang at his funeral, helping prisoners and their families. Well, we became dear friends from that train ride, and he began to take me with him to the prisons of America. And that's when my eyes were opened. I remember being in a prison in Ridgeland, South Carolina. And I was greeting all the young men in their 20s. They're there for 10, 15 years. And just for a moment, I felt like I was at Morehouse. It felt like a Black college campus, except it was prison. He placed me on his board of directors. And I got to tell you, that's where I learned how you build and run a not-for-profit agency with integrity. And so I'm sitting next to people like Jack Eckert of Eckert Drugstores, Mrs. Jack Kemp, and I'm learning. Well, while on the board, an alarming statistic surfaced that about almost 70% of all the children in America who end up in prison come from the children of those who are in prison now. And so I began to advocate, why don't we do some kind of intervention to break that cycle of intergenerational incarceration? And I tell people, when you have a wide-eyed idealist on your board who's always talking about what needs to be done, you know what you do? You get an enabling action and you send him off to do it. And so they said, this is a calling for you and we'll help you get started. And so for a couple of years, they paid for my first employee, my first office space. And they said, look, don't rush out to do any work yet. Study the problem well. Study the problem carefully to figure out what is the most effective intervention. And so I had the blessing and the privilege of bringing in people from University of Michigan, Princeton. And that's when we found, after all of our study, the most important thing you can do to break the cycle of intergenerational incarceration Number one, you must increase the density of caring, loving adults in the life orbit of children, particularly when the family disintegrates and parents go to prison. And so mentoring became a very key component to increase the density of caring, loving adults. And then interactive tutorial academic support. I did not know that by the age of 30, if you can just imagine this, by the age of 30, 60% of all Black boys in the United States of America who do not graduate from high school will have spent time in prison by the age of 30. And so it was clear to me this was something that needed to be addressed. And so I began to use my musical gift and my opportunity to reach out to people that the music gave me access to help build this organization, the U.S. Dream Academy.
Wow, what an incredible story. Timing could not be perfect as far as the need and the understanding with everything that's been happening, not only in 2020, we obviously knew years ahead, but one of the things that, I had grown up in Compton, and Bill Gates is in some of his now podcasts is talking about how Watts on every new year, really close to Compton, that Watts 40% of African American males on the new year are in prison in that area, and that how some milestones are hit and progress is being made because Compton, which is really close to Watts, has better numbers, and people are really starting to bring that number down, and yet they're so close to each other. So I think the work that you and others do are just incredible because it's beginning to make a difference. But one of the things that you mentioned during your video that really struck me, and that was normalization of incarceration. That just ring home to me because as I grew up, in Compton and went to actually graduate from Compton College, there weren't a lot of Black males in there with me. It was mostly females, but the struggles that they had to do, many of their family members and many of my friends were incarcerated, and the effect that has on you moving forward is just incredible. But can you talk a little bit about what's going to happen if we continue to just look at that as a normal situation and not really call attention to the fact that that is wrong?
Right. Well, the concept that I articulated about the normalization of incarceration really speaks to when incarceration becomes a part of the family fabric. When cousin has been in and out of prison, when brother's been in and out of prison, mama has been out of prison, daddy's been in and out of prison, there is this belief that, that's normal. Now, I feel impressed to address with you one of the greatest revelations that I've had in my work, and then I will speak to this normalization issue. And that is, we know, and Winston Churchill put it so profoundly when he said, basically, a family, a loving mother, caring daddy, raising children in a healthy relationship. He said, no superior alternative has been found. There are lots of other ways we can do it, but no superior alternative has been found. And I found one of the reasons that African Americans have such really tough times in these communities, and when I tell you, it's going to shock some people, but the family is still at the foundation of a healthy community. And African Americans were the only people group who did not come to this country as families, nor could they send for extended family like every other immigrant group. You talk about, well, how come the Cambodians can come and do well and the Vietnamese come and do well? They come as families. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 families living in the same building, in the same house. And what happens is, with the African American experience, families were torn apart, families were broken, and there is a wound. I call it a family wound that is never really healed in the African American community. It sometimes during times of spiritual renaissance, the family comes. It is an incredible reality that the family has been torn apart. Now, folks say, well, it's so long ago. Shouldn't they have gotten over it by now? The truth is, it really wasn't that long ago. My wife is 66 years old. When we go to her family gravesite and we look at my wife's father's grave plot, it shows that my wife's father was born in 1882.
Wow.
And his father was born early in the 1800s, a slave. So my wife, who is 66 years old, her grandfather, not her great-great or nothing, her grandfather was a slave. And that has had he married a Native American because there was a lot of intermarriage between Africans and Native Americans. And but here's the other part of this. All of my wife's 7 brothers and sisters have been incarcerated or been in prison at some point in their lives. Her oldest sister had 6 children, the next generation. 5 of them have been in prison. As a matter of fact, one day I was with Chuck Colson on an Easter Sunday morning in a prison in Marion, Florida. I sang at the men's prison. Then I went over to the women's prison. And when I finished singing at the women's prison, a young lady came up to me pregnant, about to have her baby in prison. And she said, "Excuse me, sir." She said, "Your wife named Linda?" I said, "Yes." She said, "That's my aunt." We didn't even know that my wife's brother's daughter was in prison and about to give birth. And so one of the keys to breaking the cycle is the rejuvenation, revitalization of the family within the African American community. But I got to tell you, it is so difficult, and I wish that I could do even more and have more success in that area, because excuse me, we would be able to save a lot of kids if we can do that.
Yeah, when we met, I think it was a year ago now with the AARP Purpose Prize. When I first met you, obviously I didn't know your singing background, and the work you've done, it's like two whole careers, right? You have this incredible singing career, which, spans, I'm speaking to you and I didn't realize you had sung for probably more presidents than anybody, right? Any singer. And then Oprah and all the incredible people you came in contact with, but then had the time and the effort to put back in founding an organization. And myself being a founder, I realized how much time and effort it takes and the work you have to do that you have to give up everything else. But one of the things that struck me, because you're the best person I know that know these quotes. And oh, I think we lost your voice. You're saying, oh, we lost Whitney's. Are you back with us there?
Yes,
You're
I'll
kind
hear
of
you. Can you hear me?
you're kind of coming out. Now I can hear you. But I
Yeah.
was saying that on when I met you, and you talked a little about integrity. And the one thing that you gave me, the quote from Norman Schwarzkopf, I've never forgot that, because I knew starting Illumination Foundation that integrity was so vital, that was the premise for why we do the work we do. Can you recite that quote, because it was so incredible?
Sure, yeah. Norman Schwarzkopf once said, when it comes to success, you need both strategy and you need character.
Yeah.
And he said, and if you got to do without one, do without strategy.
Right. Yeah. That stuck with me so much. That was an incredible quote that,
Yeah.
I thought I just held that dear. And I remember that for the last 2 years being
Wow.
in business meetings, that it struck me. But on
Yeah.
the voice side, on the singing side and your career, I had the opportunity to watch you at the great activist John Lewis funeral. I mean,
Yeah.
that had to be for you when you sang. I mean, every vocalist in the world would just be honored to do that. And when I
Yeah.
saw you there, I felt your emotion and the pride that you had. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that was an incredible, and if people haven't seen it, you can YouTube it, because even right now it gives me chill bumps.
Well, I feel impressed to tell you how the music allowed me to build this organization. First, I want to tell you about 1990. I was singing in Birmingham, Alabama. I got ready to go to the dais, and the security people started running back and forth. They said, the governor's coming. So I straightened up my tie and brushed on my suit, and they brought in a man by the name of Bill Clinton. I didn't know who he was. Nobody knew who he was. He hadn't even announced that he was running for president. So since I was in Birmingham and they said the governor's coming, I assumed he was the governor of Alabama. So when they put him beside me, I went into this long story with him of how much I love Alabama and what a great state Alabama is. And I noticed he's puzzled, why am I extolling the virtues of Alabama? And when they made the introductions, that's when it dawned on me, oh no, this is the governor of Arkansas, not Alabama. And when he became president, and I've been honored to sing for the last 6 presidents of the United States, literally have also gotten a chance to inspire them to help the work that we're doing. So when President Clinton, when I sang at his first prayer breakfast, he sent me a note of how much he was blessed by the music, and he signed it with thanks, Bill Clinton, governor of Alabama. So I have this
that's a great story.
this special thing, But one of the things that was very important, I was knocking on doors on Capitol Hill, trying to get help from senators or congresspeople, anybody, excuse me, who could help me. Well, I knocked on this senator's door and I thought I'd get the brush off and a picture and a handshake. But we were together for an hour and a half because he turned out to be one of the most prolific songwriters in the United States of America. He has written for Gladys Knight. She's recorded his music. He's written for Brooks and Dunn, country singers. His name is Senator Orrin Hatch of Utah.
Wow, didn't know that.
And Senator Hatch said to me, who's helping you with your dream for the kids? I said, well, I have a few people here and there. He said, no, I'm going to help you. And he picked up his phone and he said to his assistant, "Get me the president of Merck Laboratories on the line." And the president of Merck came on. He said, "I've got a young man who's going to do a work with kids, and I want to have a dinner to raise some money for him. I want you to set aside $100,000 for the dinner." The man said, "Sure." He said, "But I want you to get 5 of your other CEO friends to do the same." He said, "Well, I'll get to work on it." Next thing I knew, my phone rings as the president of GlaxoSmithKline with his 100,000. President of Upjohn Pharmacy or Amgen. It just kept going like that. And Senator Hatch said to me, "You know, I want this dinner to be really, truly bipartisan. Who do you know on the Democratic side that would co-host this dinner with me?" And then I told him of my relationship with President Clinton, because that faux pas, that mistake, has seared a memory, and we you know, we know each other even to today, you know. And so President Senator Hatch said, "That's who I'm going to get to co-host this dinner with me. Mrs. Clinton just became a senator, and I'm going to ask her to co-host your dinner with me."
Wow.
And so my dinner committee, he went out and got all the Republican senators to be on my dinner committee. She went and got all the Democratic senators. So my dinner committee read all 100 United States senators. And so the music was really a tremendous open door. Now, I will also tell you that 40 years ago, I was singing in Birmingham, Alabama. No, I'm Birmingham, sorry, Baltimore. I'm singing in Baltimore, Baltimore, Maryland. And I came down off of the platform and I felt a tap on my shoulder. And the lady said, "Excuse me, sir, I just heard you sing." She was discouraged, actually about to be fired from her job. She was making $25,000 a year. And she said, "I feel like I can talk to you. Do you have time to talk to me?" I said, "Sure." So she came by our home. We talked together. I'm a person of faith, so we prayed together. And after praying with her, I said, "You know, before you go, I don't know why, but God has impressed me to tell you He's going to bless you and give you an opportunity to speak to millions of people." She said, "You think God would do that for me?" And that person was Oprah Winfrey. And that's how we met. And again, it's the music for me that has allowed the open doors. And of course, she has been the most single largest benefactor of the work that we've done through over the last 20 years. And so yes, the music has been a key component to open doors and to give me an opportunity to speak to audiences that I wouldn't get any other way.
Right. Well, you know, I tell you, Whitley, I could spend the whole day talking to you. Thank God I had that opportunity in DC. I know, you know, you agreed. Hopefully, I want our audience to know this because a lot of people are from Southern California. Next year, about the same time, we're going to do this at Disney Live, and hopefully you'll sing for us.
I'll be happy to.
In the meantime, I want people to really support your organization. We're going to put your website and all the data on our website because it's such a need. Like right now, the need for our children is there's no time to waste. That we're at the tipping point that, as you said, if we don't do it now, I think we're going to have a whole lost generation. So you have our total support, and hopefully our audiences. And I want to ask you one last question. We only have less than a minute, though. If you are advising, and you may be advising soon, the Biden-Harris administration on what is the first thing they need to do for children, in a simple, you know, paragraph, what would you tell them to focus on?
Well, it's like anything else. The greatest impact you will ever have is at the point of greatest need. You just think about that. And that's, in other words, when you're a fireman in a community, you don't rush to houses that are doing fine. You rush to where the fire is. It's triaging. And I believe the most vulnerable young people are those who are growing up without guidance, without families, without academic support. Give me 30 seconds to tell you, I found one of the main reasons that our kids are not doing well in school. I did not know whenever a child receives a bad grade from a teacher, almost never ever is the bad grade handed back to the child with help, with tutorials, with corrective instruction to fix the problem they didn't understand that caused them to get a bad grade in the first place. It's one of the few places where we routinely do diagnosis and never do a prescription, and we call it education. And so it is so important to get kids academic corrective help and support so they can understand the basics of reading and writing and math, and then there are lots of other life skills we need to teach them. Character, we need to teach them the how to chase their dreams. But I think the most important thing that the Biden-Harris ticket can do is to focus help where it's needed most. Children who are falling behind, children who, without our intervention and help, will fall through the cracks.
Wow. Couldn't have said it better myself. And one of the questions that we're asking all the speakers, and I've got to take the time to hear from you. What are your hopes for 2021 now that we've been, are still in 2020, but we're asking all our speakers again, what is your hope for 2021?
In terms of course, there's so many ways to address the question, personal hopes. But in terms of the organization and my Dream Academy, my prayer is that we'll be able to find a way to continue to sustain it. I almost feel like I cursed my organization at our first board meeting because I said to them, we were born in miracles and we will be sustained by them. And that's really how we've been sustained, and needing $1 million miracle every year is a tough way to live. It's a tough way to carry on. And so I am hoping that 2021 will be our year to find a way to have a consistent stream of income that allows us to sustain the work. Thousands of kids have come through our program. And by the way, for every 10,000 kids that you keep out of the criminal justice system, you save the United States of America $1.5 billion annually.
Yeah. Wow. Well,
10,000 kids you keep out of that system.
Right. Well, I can tell you from your lips to God's ears and our audience and funders, we're here to help you, and I can't wait to partner more with you. Thank you, my friend. I just really appreciate it. So
You're welcome.
That ends our time for today. This concludes this session on existing disparities in healthcare and education. Up next, we have a video from one of our community partners. Join us for the next session at 11 a.m. as we discuss the barriers to social justice. Thank you, Whitney.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
all, this is Dr. Norman, physical therapist at Fortify Strength, and today we're going to teach you how to start running. Running is a very simple thing we can do to keep our bodies and our hearts in tip-top shape, and it really doesn't require any equipment except for shoes. And you can use it as a sort of active meditation. We've gone through a lot of research and we want to give you a list of things to not only progress your running safely and without injury, but to also provide a few tips that can help you keep running. Let's fortify our running. Today, we're going to go over the 4 most important things to consider before you start a new running program, along with a bonus tip at the end for making your runs more effective and more entertaining using story. Number 1, start slow, go slow. So the first thing we want to go over is to get used to the act of running. Nobody starts off doing backflips, they work their way up to it, which is the same for running. About 80% of all running injuries is caused by overexertion, meaning many people are pushing themselves too much. And I promise you, if you have no experience running and you try running 3 miles, it's gonna be painful. You're gonna hate yourself and you're never gonna wanna run again. Start slow and just listen to your body. You're gonna fall into what feels comfortable for you. Number 2, track your training. It is important to track how often, how long, and how far your runs are. You can even track how you felt on your runs. And this works a few ways. It helps you keep motivated and it will help you progress because generally we want to increase training by 10 to 30% every week. So like if you're running 1,000 meters one week, you can try running 1,100 to 1,300 meters next week. And finally, it will help you get a feel for the signs of overtraining, which brings us to number 3, short rests. Running is the same. Any sharp pain or discomfort that doesn't go away with a day of rest usually means you've done too much. But also if you feel tilted or tired all the time, you've also probably done too much. If you feel sore, you can do active recovery by training other body parts while you rest instead of running all the time. You can do body weight exercises like squatting, push-ups, or even stretching. But just know that stretching has not been shown to be preventative of injury. But if it feels good, you can do it. You're generally not doing any harm. Interval training can also help with training because you're sprinkling in rest breaks when you need them. Having an app will help you stay on track and stay motivated. For me, I use Pokemon Go. I spin a stop, I catch them on, and I keep running. Just remember, rest is just as important as training. And now our 4th point, footwear faux pas. I know you're gonna ask about shoes, so we're gonna talk about shoes. As long as your shoes are snug and comfy, you're fine. Just take the time to break them in before you run. Our shoes should act more like comfortable armor than coffins for our feet. And generally, having high or low arches doesn't impact our running as much as training tolerance does. So when you hear about fancy footwear or orthotics, they don't really do much in terms of like injury prevention. Most of the time, people are just trying to sell you stuff. So to recap, don't worry too much about specifics yet. Just listen to your body and start slow. Watch for signs of overtraining because rest is just as important as exercise. And finally, footwear doesn't matter as long as it's comfortable and snug. Bonus tip, how do we increase our desire to run, our want to run? Well, we give it narrative. This can be as simple as listening to your favorite tunes to give you a rhythm. Like for me, I love video game soundtracks. One in particular was the Crystal Chronicles soundtrack. Whenever I hear the boss fight going on, whenever I hear all the different maps coming on, I really get into the running mood and it really improves my pace. I see myself in the game, I see myself in the training montage, casting spells and whatnot. But yeah, listen to music while you're running. Groundbreaking. But let me take it a step further. Have you ever tried running at night? I found that when I run at night, I run faster because I'm just scared. And even bring this a step further, you can listen to a scary podcast like the No Sleep podcast. This creates sort of like an intense narrative drive that has a physiological effect on your body, and now you're running for your life. Of course, this increases stress hormones, and it's not something I would do regularly out of safety, but it's an example of how you can create a story in your mind to affect your run physically. Maybe you're running from a horde of parkouring zombies, or maybe you're running from Darth Vader with the blueprints of the Death Star. I don't know. The more vivid your story, the more creative it is, the more your body and your mind will react to it, and the more it will help you on your run. Don't believe me? Just give it a try. And here's one last freebie. If you're a grad student with a lot of student debt, you can pretend that if you complete your run at your personal best, they'll cancel your debt. But that's just wishful thinking on my part. So, That about wraps it up. If you follow these tips, you'll be in a good place to start running for health and for fun.
Hello, my name is Dr. Valicia Adams Kellum, and I'm the President and CEO of St. Joseph Center. St. Joseph Center has been serving low-income and homeless individuals for over 40 years. We have offices on the west side of Los Angeles, in downtown LA, and in South Los Angeles. Today, we serve over 10,000 people annually across 4 pillars: outreach and engagement, housing, mental health, and education and vocational services. Like the Illumination Foundation and so many nonprofit organizations, St. Joseph Center has been at the forefront of the pandemic response. We have heroes that work for St. Joseph Center that have done whatever was necessary to help families in need and individuals who are homeless make it through this very difficult time. But I think it's very important to acknowledge the systemic racism and injustices that has made this time even more difficult for people of color. We've seen an overrepresentation of Black and brown people who've contracted COVID-19 and who are dying at twice the rate of others. And it's important, I think, to really talk about the intersection of homelessness, poverty, and race. See, I was invited to join the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority Ad Hoc Committee on Black People Experiencing Homelessness. We really started to see the disparities around the population of Black people who were overrepresented among the homeless. You see, the stark reality is that Black and brown people are disproportionately represented among those who are homeless, who are impoverished, who lack adequate access to health and educational resources, and the like. Nonprofit organizations must begin to speak to the despair that we witness every day in our work. When we see the long lines in our food banks, in our food pantries, and yes, we gladly serve. We gladly walk alongside our clients and do whatever it takes. But we must acknowledge the overrepresentation of Black and brown people who have to rely on food banks and Section 8 vouchers to house their families, to feed their children, and to make it. This country has at times had policies that were critically unfair and disproportionately harmful to Black and brown people. At St. Joseph Center, we've always had social justice as a North Star, knowing that we fall short in this country of making it a place where everyone can feel free and aspire to be who and what they want to be. I think the pandemic and the brutal murder of George Floyd put an all of our hearts the fact that things are just not balanced and that some people don't have an equal shot. In my own life, I've often shied away from talking about the racial disparities, the impact of my own race on my life, and what my family has had to face. But this time has given me a renewed sense of urgency and inspiration to speak up, even at times when I feel uncomfortable, when I worry that I'll make someone feel bad. When I talk about structural racism, I worry that sometimes people will look away and think that I'm blaming them. I think this is a time for collective responsibility. I think it's a time in our sector to address the fact that there are more people of color on the streets than any other population, and that there's something baked into our system that's been critically wrong. And we must speak up, and we must do better. The sad reality is that the statistics speak for themselves. African Americans and Latinx in the US have been 3 times more likely to contract COVID-19 than white residents and nearly twice as likely to die from it. African American women die from preventable pregnancy-related complications at 3 to 4 times the rate of white women, and Black workers are twice as likely to be unemployed as white workers overall, at 6.4% versus 3.1%. Sadly, Black workers with a college degree even are more likely to be unemployed than similarly educated white workers. And the racial disparities that we see around wealth are equally alarming. The average wealth of African Americans with a bachelor's degree or higher is less than that of a white high school graduate. White households are more likely to be homeowners at 68% in comparison to the 44% and 45% of African American and Latinx households, respectively. Latinx people make up 17% of the general population in the US, but 24% of people living in deep poverty. We have the ability to make a big difference in people's lives. And I think this moment calls for us to not just meet the immediate need, but have an impact on the system that is producing the need. I will be a part of the crescendo that says no more, that says I want to be a part of a change in our country, a change in our agencies, and more importantly, at the individual level, a change in our hearts. Thank you.
I'm Heidi Marston, Executive Director of the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority. Thanks so much for having me here today to talk about some of the barriers to social justice that people experiencing homelessness face all across California. Today we're going to talk about 5 particular barriers that people experiencing homelessness face that LAHSA has been taking a look at throughout our system. They are stagnating incomes, the lack of affordable housing, underinvestment in mental health infrastructure, the undermining of tenant protections, and mass incarceration. So let's start with an overview of homelessness. We know that homelessness is a significant challenge in California, with an estimated 151,000 people experiencing homelessness across the state. About 568,000 people are experiencing homelessness across the country. Here in LA County, our unhoused population is at 66,000 people. There are many causes of homelessness, but today we're going to focus on policy decisions that have either been made or not made that have directly contributed to the number of people experiencing homelessness across the state. Those policy choices have led to a disproportionate number of Black people becoming homeless in LA County. While only 8% of the overall population is Black, Black people comprise 34% of the population experiencing homelessness. Now let's talk about how stagnating wages and changes in public assistance have directly impacted the number of people falling into homelessness. Reforms at the state and national level have left low-income wages stagnant for over a decade. When Congress passed welfare reform in 1996, the percentage of low-income families receiving cash assistance dropped from 76% to 23%, and the situation has not improved since then. The freezing of the federal minimum wage and California's public assistance have left low-income families with a loss of income as housing costs have soared, leading to a significant increase in the number of people experiencing homelessness in our communities. In addition to stagnating wages, affordable housing development and cuts to it have also had a significant impact on the number of people who fall into homelessness. We began to see the decline in critical affordable housing programs in 1979 with funding for the Community Development Block Grant Program, or CDBG, dropping 77% since then. CDBG is one of the programs that cities and counties use to fund affordable housing programs. Affordable housing took another blow in 2011 when the state eliminated redevelopment, which had previously provided more than $1 billion for local redevelopment. Next, we'll discuss state mental health reform and how its incomplete nature has exacerbated homelessness. In 1972, the state ended institutionalization when it implemented the Lanterman-Petrus Short Act. While the intent was to replace state institutionalization with community-based mental health resources, California never adequately funded these alternatives, leaving many without access to care and services. In recent decades, we've also seen weakened renter protections at the state level. Two pieces of state legislation have undermined rent control protections that would have helped keep rent prices affordable in California. 1985's Ellis Act, which simplified the process for evicting rent-controlled tenants, and 1995's Costa-Hawkins Act, which eliminated cities' and counties' ability to enact rent control protections. The last barrier we'll discuss is mass incarceration and the disproportionate impact it has on our Black and Latinx communities. In general, law enforcement standards like broken windows, policing policies like stop and frisk have contributed to many more people becoming involved in the criminal justice system. As you've seen here, many state and federal policies have directly contributed to the number of people experiencing homelessness. But because public policy created it, public policy can also rectify this. We must support increased funding for homelessness and housing programs at the state and federal levels, while also reducing barriers to interim, supportive, and affordable housing. We must advocate for greater tenant protections. We must support policies that make it easier for those with a history of justice involvement to find jobs and housing, while opposing policies that increase criminalization. Together, we can absolutely overcome these barriers and change the policies that are in place that keep people experiencing homelessness unhoused, and to protect people who are at risk of falling into homelessness to never become homeless at all. I'm really looking forward to working with all of you on this, and I know that we can do it not only in LA County, but across the state of California.
I'm Jeff Olivet with Racial Equity Partners, and I'm here to talk about the intersection of structural racism and homelessness. There are three things that I want you to know. One is that homelessness is not new. Two, homelessness is not colorblind. And three, homelessness is not inevitable. Like many of you, I got into this field a long time ago and was essentially told that homelessness was a new phenomenon, that it had come on the scenes in the United States in the late 1970s or early 1980s, and if it just happened, then we should be able to solve it quickly. And that is just simply not true. When you dig into the history of poverty, of oppression, of the way the downtrodden have been trampled on and forgotten about in this country, we know now that homelessness goes back to the beginning of the European colonization of what is now the United States. We know that people of color were made homeless at much higher rates than white people, and that is still true. Homelessness has cycled through multiple waves of reality in the United States, going all the way back to the 1640s, with wars and natural disaster and economic collapse driving spikes of homelessness through the 19th century, through various points in the 20th century, including the Great Depression. Now, since the 1970s, we are in what is the longest and most sustained spike in homelessness in the history of this country. Homelessness is not new. We also know that homelessness is not colorblind. While people of all races and ethnicities experience homelessness, we know that people of color, particularly African Americans and Native American people, experience homelessness at dramatically higher rates than their white counterparts do. This is no accident. This is the systems behaving exactly as they were designed to behave. And when you design systems, essentially over decades and centuries, by white people, for white people, I'll give you an example of this. The whole system of redlining that discriminated against people of color, not only in residential segregation, but in terms of who could buy a home and who could then accumulate wealth generation after generation. That was a system designed by white people for white people. And when you leave people of color, both out of the design of those systems and out of the benefit of those systems, then the disparity continues to grow. And so what we see today in terms of racial disparities in homelessness in the United States is the result of one policy decision after another that go back decades and even centuries and continue to be perpetuated today. So homelessness is most definitely not colorblind. The last thing I want to say is that homelessness is not inevitable. Despite these problems being deeply entrenched historically and structurally, despite the problem of homelessness reflecting the deep structural racism that still drives outcomes for people of color in the United States, despite all of that, homelessness is not inevitable. We designed these structures, we designed these policies. Surely we can design something better. Surely we can design a housing response that is racially equitable. Surely we can come to a belief that housing is a basic human right that anyone should be able to access, not just if you deserve it, not just if you stay on your medications for mental health issues or get sober from a drug or alcohol problem or work hard enough. Housing is the prerequisite for all that. Housing first has proven that once you have stable housing, it's easier to get a job and keep a job. It's easier to stay connected with family and friends. It's easier to get clean and stay clean off of drugs and alcohol. It's easier to stay in a place of mental wellness and stability. So let us remember, as we continue this critically important work of fighting for an end to homelessness for all people, it is not new, but we can fix it. It is not colorblind, but we can achieve racial justice. It is not inevitable. Together, we can end homelessness in community after community across the United States until homelessness is a thing of the past.
Hi, welcome back. We're now joined live with Dr. Valicia Adams Kellum, President and CEO of St. Joseph Center, Heidi Marston, Executive Director of LA Homeless Services Authority, and Jeff Olivet, co-founder at Racial Equity Partners. Welcome you all. Thank you. And we're so excited to have you with us. And I'm going to get right into the questions because we continue to have questions from our audience. And I'll start with Jeff. Jeff, for our many audience members that work in social services, government, and healthcare, can you explain the importance of prioritizing strategic anti-racism plans in the workplace and fields in the sector as a whole?
It's a really good question, Paul. I think there's been so much emphasis on the discourse about structural racism in the United States over the last several months in the wake of George Floyd's murder and Breonna Taylor's murder and so many other tragedies. We also know that these tragic events are in the long march of the history of this country. And so the structural racism we're trying to dismantle is deeply embedded. And it's deeply embedded in every system and every structure and every organization that we work in. So whether you're in healthcare or homelessness and housing or the faith community or government, no matter what sector you're in, you're bumping up against structural racism. And regardless of your role in your organization or your institution, you have a part to play in dismantling those structures. And so when we think about dismantling racism, that happens at multiple levels at the same time. First of all, it happens in our own hearts and minds, and we do that kind of interior work regardless of the skin we're in, regardless of whether you're a white ally like I am, or a person of color who has been the on the oppressive end of the racist history of this country and our communities. You have a role to play in kind of unpacking all of that and becoming a change agent in your organization, whether you're a street outreach worker or a case manager or a CEO or a board member or an elected official. No matter your role, you have a sphere of influence that you can change, and you can be a part of creating an anti-racist organization. And I say that term very carefully. Ibram Kendi, who wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist and Stamped from the Beginning, says there's no such thing as being neutral. You can't be non-racist. You can't just sort of not be that over there. You actually need to be part of the process of change. And if you're not, then you're shoring up the status quo. And so I think all of us have a decision to make in terms of how we play a role in dismantling the racist structures that certainly drive dramatically disproportionate rates of Black and brown people experiencing homelessness and so many other catastrophes in our society.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. The next question is for Heidi. And, obviously COVID-19, many of the questions are how is that going to impact, moving forward, the homelessness problem. But the actual question was, how will COVID-19 exaggerate stagnating incomes and impact those at risk of homeless? And I know that LAHSA and many nonprofits in LA have really started transitioning people off the street into, potentially being housed and hopefully jobs. How do you feel that's going to impact moving forward?
Yeah, it's an important question, and it really hits at the heart of the issue, because we know homelessness was a crisis before COVID-19 and it will remain a crisis after. Just as context, in LA County, last year, 207 people were housed through our system every single day. And every single day, 227 people fell into homelessness. So the rate was already being outpaced, even though our system and our ability to house people was getting better. Through COVID-19, we saw 1.2 million unemployment claims in LA County in May. And that was just 3 months into the pandemic. So there are estimates that anywhere from 36,000 to 120,000 households could potentially be evicted or fall into homelessness. And it is an onslaught that we are watching closely. Frankly, our system isn't prepared for. When we think about systemic racism and housing security and income equality, we really need to think about those safety nets and how we bolster those and stop people from falling in, because
tremendous progress in sheltering people who are already unhoused through COVID-19. So on one side, we don't want to go back to the status quo and lose ground. And on the other side, we can't have tens of thousands of more people falling in and continue to overwhelm the system that was already significantly overwhelmed.
Great. Wow, that's a scary thought. And the next question is for Valicia. I grew up in Compton. I was there for the first Watts riots. I was there second with the Rodney King riots. But I don't think I had seen anything like this last 2020 and the outpouring of people who really seem to understand that we're at a time now that we have to make that change and really look this problem in the face. One of our audience members asked a question. You addressed your own renewed sense of urgency and inspiration and a positive impacting Black and Brown communities. How do we get people to continue to talk about this, even if it makes them feel uncomfortable? And how do we get them to not look away?
Well, thank you. I guess the first thing is just for us to realize that this is hard for everyone. And I think we all have to admit that it's uncomfortable to talk about race. It's uncomfortable for me to talk about race. And I think when I'm talking to people who haven't grown up like me in my skin, I have to admit to them that I'm afraid. I'm afraid to talk about how race has impacted me, but that I'm inspired to do it, that I must do it. So I think we have to be honest about the pain that's associated with racism, discrimination, and the various disparities that I noted in my video, to say that we're all hurting and all struggling. And I think when I admit that it's frightening to talk about it, because I was raised to just focus on what I can do, what's in my control, and I admit that this puts me in a very vulnerable position, I think that people can maybe get a little less defensive. And I think also not blaming people for the racism that we're all dealing with, but to acknowledge that it's a collective responsibility and a time for ownership. Owning the impact of slavery, white supremacy, mass incarceration, the Jim Crow era, all of that makes up our history. And so we are all a part of that. And I think if we can, in a loving but authentic manner, to say that this has been hurtful and that this is with me. And I think sometimes when people see that I have a PhD and I went to Stanford, that somehow I may have avoided this painful historical injustice, called, discrimination and racism. And when I'm honest and I say, no, I have experienced it as well. And even though it's hard for me to talk about it and I'm afraid that people will look away or feel that I don't care anymore about them or want to be in relation, I want to then remind them, I want to be in relation and I'm leaning in and we do this together.
Wow, great. Thank you. Jeff, we have a couple questions and they're real similar, but I'm going to combine both of them. You mentioned that since the 1970s, this has been our most stagnant time towards homelessness. What do you think is the main reason why there is no noticeable change and the disparities? But on the similar question, for those of them that say housing is a privilege, what do you say to them?
I guess I'll start there. Housing is a right. Housing is and should be a basic human right. And if we start with that position, then we very quickly move to a place of housing justice and racial equality, at least around housing. I want to pick up on a couple of things that Heidi and Valicia said in terms of the moment we're in right now. To Heidi's point about, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but bailing the bathtub at 207 people a day, but 227 are coming into homelessness. You can't bail that bathtub fast enough. If we're not going upstream, if we're not preventing inflow into homelessness, particularly from systems that also witness overrepresentation of people of color. I'm talking about criminal justice and the reentry into homelessness, foster care and youth and young adults aging out of foster care straight into homelessness, the eviction industrial complex, such that it is. If we're not turning off those faucets, we will never bail the bathtub fast enough. And so, Paul, to the question of why aren't we making more progress over the last 40 plus years, we are making all kinds of progress at the individual level. We're doing a really good job housing people, and housing first, which starts with the presumption of housing as a basic human right, is a great model for that. Let's just get people housed, and then we can deal with a lot of other things, economic instability and mental health issues and social connectedness and everything else. But if we're not getting serious about prevention, none of those technologies will work on the scale needed to address the problem. In the bigger sweep of history, this wave of homelessness we are in right now, we have been there before. And you can track homelessness back, 400 years, 450 years on the continent of North America. And as colonists came to the East Coast and up the coast of California, Native people were enslaved and killed, and there was genocide, and there was chattel slavery, and at every moment in those eras, and at every huge economic kind of flashpoint, there was homelessness, and there was a lot of it. But if you just take the kind of the microcosm of the Great Depression, the way we ended up moving out of massive homelessness was through a huge infusion of housing and jobs programs and a social safety net and income stability through Social Security and the food stamps program and Medicaid and Medicare and these structural solutions. So we're doing a great job solving homelessness on the individual level, but it's not an individual problem. It's a structural problem. And we will never solve a structural problem by ending individual homelessness. That's good work. We keep doing it, but we got to get to the structural root causes. One last thought on the sort of inflection point we are in which we find ourselves here in 2020 around race. Paul, it's interesting to hear you talk about all of the Watts riots and the Rodney King protests and the current state of things in 2020. My deepest hope is that we move beyond talk and that we move beyond protest. Those are essential acknowledgments of the current situation, but it's very, very easy to slide right back into business as usual. And the example of this is we saw all of these white CEOs and executive directors issuing beautiful statements of solidarity on May 25th when they realized that there was still racism in America. And what has happened since? Some organizations are putting that into a plan and into action. Many aren't. Many don't know where to start. They haven't conjured up the courage to really create change in their organizations and in the systems in which they operate. So my prayer for this inflection point of 2020 is that things are different this time, that we turn a hope for justice and a prayer for justice into concrete, implementable action for justice.
Great. I'm going to have a follow-up question just on that for you in a little bit, but Heidi, I'd love this question because Illumination Foundation as a housing provider, people come to us all the time, just say, why don't you just build a shelter? Why don't you just get housing? You guys are at a total different scale. And the question is, Heidi, it sounds like from policy changes and what that governmental implements, it has been an uphill battle for the affordable housing for the homeless. What can we do to stop these policy changes? And I want to just add to that how, because so many people had asked us, and it really is a hard question, is what can the average person do, when we have some policies, some building, things that have been in place since the 30s that won't allow us to just freely move into a community. What seems like when we get the shelters built and the housing built, then the residents are happy and they don't even know you're there. How does the common everyday citizen advocate for these policy changes?
Honestly, it starts with saying yes. It starts with saying yes to building things in your backyards. It starts with people stepping in to be leaders in their neighborhoods and their communities and advocating for these things to be built out. Because the reality is, whether you're housed or unhoused, these are our neighbors. And we need to treat them that way. And we need to treat them that way consistently, whether we're in Beverly Hills, whether we're in the Valley, whether we're in South LA. And so that in and of itself and setting that example is huge. It also matters who we vote for. It also matters the policies that we back up. And in my presentation, in my video, you saw there's some really big things that have happened at the federal level over the last 50 years that are having devastating impacts today on the number of people who fall into homelessness, from minimum wage not being increased and affordable housing grants and all of that really falling by the wayside. Politicians listen, and policymakers, especially in a time like this where we're seeing a transition in leadership in an administration, now is the time for your voice to be heard in relifting up those things and really bringing this back to the domestic economic policies that need to be shifted. That's one thing in looking back, and frankly, moving forward, we cannot underestimate the value of the policy decisions we are making right now and the long-term consequences, good or bad. We have a responsibility to pull that thread all the way to make sure that what we are doing is not going to have some sort of negative impact in the long run and further perpetuate the income inequality, the racial injustice that we continue to see.
Great. By the way, that was a really articulate plan that you put on your slides. We're going to make sure we send that out, make it available for all the people that are in our audience.
Thank you.
Alicia, you know, we also understand that a lot of the people that we talk to need examples. And I know at St. Joseph Center, you guys do an incredible work. One of the questions that came in was how at St. Joseph Center, I added that part in, is addressing the barriers and equities you have discussed. And can you give it can you give us an example? And I obviously you guys are doing incredible work, so I think that would help if you could tell what you guys are doing at St. Joseph Center.
Thank you so much. And one of the things we looked at several years ago was who is working for St. Joseph Center, and is our staff reflective of the people we're serving? And we found that even back to 2012, the vast majority of managers working for St. Joe's were white, 60%. And there was a national article that came out starting to challenge our sector and saying more people who work in the sector need to be reflective of those we're serving. And we weren't there. And the line staff were not reflective either. So what we did was we looked at our job descriptions and we looked at our requirements, and we realized that we were requiring, bachelor's degrees for every position or licenses for all the work when there was someone with mental health background. And we still have a lot of physicians, PhDs, licensed practitioners working for us, but we also now have many more people than ever. Actually, 75% of our agency now today are made up of people of color. And some have bachelor's degrees and some have licenses, but not all. And we realized that we were really, by requiring those educational backgrounds in every area of our agency, was furthering systemic racism and the barriers. And we were just trying to do good work and bring really qualified folks. But there's so much quality work being done right on the front line of people with lived experience. So we now have folks with lived experience throughout our agency, people with long histories of incarceration working for St. Joseph Center, people with backgrounds in drug and alcohol addiction, in management and executive leadership. So we're really excited about how we've been able to move the dial. And now I can say that when my staff stands up, we actually look like the people we're serving. And the other thing we're doing is really investing in our staff, making sure we have market rate salaries, that we're competitive. We are doing an investment on behalf of our staff into a retirement fund, and they don't have to necessarily match that in order to get our investment, because we believe that that furthers the disparity. If you can afford to save, you get the extra match. And we wanted to, remove that kind of barrier to people receiving an investment and getting ahead. So that's just one example of how we are both supporting our staff, really looking at walking our talk. Yes, a lot of us did put out the Black Lives Matter statements and the pro-social justice statements, and we're trying to make sure we live our talk.
Wow, that is great, because I mean and we found that same thing, the win-win of having people that are working in the community that might not have other chances, but could with a nonprofit, and not about us, without us. I love that saying that, we really need to have 30% of our staff were previously consumers. So it just makes a big difference. So
Right.
that's
Our boards need to be reflective as well of the
right.
people we're serving. And St. Joseph's recently added someone with lived experience on our board and really diversifying at every level.
Right. Awesome. Jeff, here's the second question, and I kind of broke it up because I knew you could probably get a lot, but how would you design a program that would add more equity to your organization? How would you start to design it? The question is, what would be an example of how we can design a housing solution that is racially equitable? And we have multiple questions on that, and I think it's really confusing. Because again, I think yesterday I was talking to Bobby Watts, the executive director of National Healthcare for the Homeless. When he started, he came in as the CEO. He said, I want to begin with diversity. And I looked at him and I thought, how can we be more diverse? I mean, we had everybody there, I thought, from all major, ethnic groups, income groups. We had consumers, but that's not what he was talking about. And I learned a lot. What can you bring to the table to talk about how would you begin to design that?
Well, to bridge from the conversation about diversity into one about kind of programmatic change or achieving equitable outcomes is an important step. I think a lot of organizations focus rightly on diversity and inclusion, which are critical steps. Everything that Alicia was just talking about, Paul, what you talk about Bobby doing, I've known Bobby for 15, 20 years when he was running Care for the Homeless in New York City and now the National Healthcare for the Homeless Council. And I've seen him and his organizations make great strides around diversity at the board level, at the staff level, in all the ways you all have been talking about. The way I think about diversity is that it's necessary but not sufficient. Of course, we should strive for organizations and leadership and boards that reflect the people we serve. That's a no-brainer. Figure out how to get there. That's, in a lot of ways, that's not the hard part. I mean, it is hard. I don't want to underestimate it, but that's the foundational piece from which you can start creating anti-racist programs. Another piece is to take a really good look at your data. And I don't just mean in terms of disproportionality, but I mean in terms of housing outcome and retention and who's getting which kind of housing intervention. A lot of communities that we work in, we see assessment scores tipping a whiter, more male, older group into permanent supportive housing and a younger, blacker family and youth group into rapid rehousing or no intervention at all. So when you're kind of creating prioritization decisions that are perpetuating racial inequity, you got to stop that right now. And you don't know how to stop that unless you've actually looked at your data. The other thing that you find is that often there are subgroups within these kind of broad racial categories that are dramatically more impacted. So the national research study we did called Spark a number of years ago, supporting partnerships for anti-racist communities, we found that youth and young adults under the age of 25 were way more likely to be Black and Latinx and Native American than older single adults. Every group was disproportionately Black and brown. There's no question about that. But the worst disparities were among youth and young adults. Following that quickly are young families headed primarily by Black women, other groups as well. So what do you do with that information once you know that that's true? You start targeting programmatic design and intervention towards where those disparities are worse. And it's not to say that you neglect everyone else or don't provide programming or anything like that. But if you know, for example, a community we were working in the Northeast found that 25% of their homeless population were Black kids under 18. one in four of the homeless folks in that community. That's not what the politicians thought about homelessness. It's not what the general public thought about homelessness, but it was true. And most of those kids were in single parent families with parents under the age of 25. So all of a sudden, then you know where to point your energy. You know where to point your program design and budgets and that sort of thing. And that community was able to reduce that proportionality down to 13% of the homeless population. Now, that's not, in some ways, it's not a total victory. You want to end homelessness for every one of those kids and for every other person in that community, regardless of their racial identity. But it gives you an indication of where to point resources. Then you take the step of bringing people with lived experience onto staff, and in the design of those programs, you're going to get the programs right in a way that you're not if you're a white leadership team sitting around a table writing a grant together, or a white board making decisions about budgets. So the diversity piece and the program design piece come together at various points. And that's why we talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity. These are sort of different dimensions of the fight against racism.
Great. All right, thank you. It's kind of funny. I know where you see all these questions coming in, and some of them they've been asked for us before, but this one's for Heidi. So, how is homelessness and why is it being criminalized? And what steps can you take to provide supportive services instead of arresting people?
Mhm.
So, and that's a good question. We get that all the time. Like,
Yeah.
why are people being arrested instead of services?
It's a big question as well. There's a lot to unpack in that. A really big piece of it that we see acutely here in LA, given our the size of our unsheltered population, is this growing intolerance, right, of seeing it and seeing people on the street, and sweeping it away, whether it's through arrest or anything else, is not going to resolve it. So what we do, and we partner with agencies like St. Joseph Center to educate people, to really show arresting is not the way to solve homelessness. It's through services, it's through providing real shelter. We demonstrated that through COVID-19 in our efforts with Project Room Key, where because we were able to work with hotels and motels across the county, over 6,000 people went indoors who were outside before. And that really demonstrated to us not only that people want services, they will accept it, and we're capable of doing it, but that there's real power when the federal government, the state, and the city and local counties all come together. We treat this as an emergency, as a crisis. We resource it in the way we want. And Felicia can speak to this too, but I think we all moved faster than we thought we could. And the momentum we were able to build was incredible, because we stopped focusing on blaming the people and trying to move them and trying to arrest them or cite them. And we focused on the solutions that would not only get people inside, protect their public health and safety, but also give them the services and the housing access that they need to permanently resolve the situation. I keep seeing that as the alternative for us. It's not about putting people indoors and leaving them. It's about putting them indoors and providing that housing on the back end, so we see the throughput. And once we find that balance in our system, we're not going to see a need or the intolerance that we have, or the levels of people who are languishing on the street. I think across the board, people are frustrated of seeing it, and people who are out there are frustrated of having to live with that and not having options. And so we want to create that access in any way that we can.
Great. Felicia, one of the questions is from a nonprofit leader, is why is it important for nonprofit organizations to serve as leaders in addressing racial injustice?
Oh, it's so important. That's a great question. I think it's important for us to recognize that while many of us have a mission of serving the most vulnerable and making sure that our pantries have food, that we are making sure that we're addressing food insecurity, housing needs, and providing Section 8 when it's needed and shelter when it's needed. But we have to step back to also ask the more systemic question of why people are lined up and why are they reliant upon us for their basic human needs. We are at the forefront of seeing the despair and seeing the inequities. So we know firsthand who is in the line, and they're people of color. And we can speak to that. We can talk about what that looks like when our staff is white and the people in the line are people of color. We don't want to have that any longer, and our agencies must make a change. But we also witness, what it's like to have a family who, are working poor or losing, jobs, and feel that it's because of the skin that they're in. We sit in case management sessions and we hear experience after experience, the police brutality that some of our families have experienced, or the fear that they have of the folks who are undocumented and afraid that someone's going to bust into their homes and take them away from their children. We hear those stories, and we have to share those stories, and we have to go beyond just feeding, and we have to keep feeding, and we have to keep housing and clothing people, but we must speak the truth of what we're seeing and the injustice around that.
Right. Great answer. Thank you. We're limited on time now. We have just a little time left, and I wanted, this question is for all of you, because obviously we have a new administration. We're going to see some changes, which we're welcoming a lot of the changes. So the question is, if you had a chance, and believe me, you may have a chance to sit down with the Biden and Harris administration, what would be the one thing that you would give them as they're working in social inequities and social justice, pertinent to what we're seeing, all of us as providers and working in this field? Where would they start? And so, Jeff, we'll start with you. You're on a committee and a panel with them, and you're explaining to them what you feel is a need. What would you address first?
There are some very immediate things to undo the damage of the last 4 years. One of those would be on day one to repeal what's been a ban on racial equity training in federal agencies and among federal contractors and grantees. That's got to get undone immediately. You can't have any kind of conversation about ending homelessness if race and racism is off the table. Reestablishing a firm commitment to housing first, and then fully resourcing it so that we really do kind of operationalize housing as a basic human right. And those are two kind of immediate things to sink the new administration's teeth into. The other thing I think we haven't done well in Democratic or Republican administrations over the last 30 or 40 years is connecting the dots between all of these other systems that are failing together to result in homelessness. And there's got to be more done at the national level and at the local and state level to connect the dots across systems and across issues.
Great. Heidi.
Well, since Jeff said the initial things, I'll just go on top of that and we'll keep building. One thing that has been talked about that I'm really excited and it's absolutely a need is this universal housing voucher and creating this real access to affordable housing or housing subsidies. In LA County alone, our waiting list is 10 to 15 years to get a Section 8 voucher. That's unacceptable. And so seeing real federal action in providing people housing resources, it's just the tip of the iceberg, but it's such a critical piece of it.
Great. And Felicia.
And yes, I guess I'll build on what has already been said to say, I think we need to really focus on alternatives to incarceration. We passed Measure J in LA County, and I think it's important to look at how we can increase investment in housing, wellness, and mental health. And that there's ways to decrease the number of people who are incarcerated and to invest in prevention and making sure that families and individuals, those young people that are struggling out there, have the investment in their lives that they need and deserve.
Great. Well, I tell you, you guys have my vote when we start the committee with Camilla and Joe. We're going to say these guys are it. They're the experts. And in closing, we've been asking all of our guests, because it's been a really unprecedented and a really tough 2020 on everybody. Looking forward into 2021, what is your forecast? How do you think, or what do you think will happen? I know we're excited that the vaccine will be here, but we're going to still be plagued, as all of you alluded to in your videos, that we still have these problems, right? But how do you anticipate 2021 will play out? Because next year at this time, when we all gather, we're going to play this and say, wow, you guys were awesome in predicting what happens. We're going to look at you for the stock market. But I want to hear from all of you what your dreams, hopes, aspirations, and even fears look moving forward in 2021. Start with you, Jack.
Well, predictions and dreams are two very, very different things. And I have a tendency to go dark quickly, so I'm going to avoid that right now and say my hope for the next year is that we learn how to take care of each other, and that we come out of the COVID crisis and the racial upheaval of 2020 and the political upheaval of 2020 with a deeper commitment to love one another, and to do that in action, not just in fluffy words, and to do that with budgets, and to do that with very sharp program design and scaling up the stuff that works, and not just around homelessness, but around so many issues that leave so many of our brothers and sisters behind. I hope we will come out of this year of crisis more full of optimism that we can actually become a good and just society if we choose to.
All right.
It's not a prediction, Paul, just to be clear on that.
Just, yeah. Well, I'm glad you didn't go dark. We have fires here, so a lot of people had to evacuate, and we're not there yet, but we're looking for some good news. So I'm glad you didn't go dark. Heidi.
Of course, one of my fears is that it's going to take a year or longer for us to truly see the impacts of COVID, whether it's on the physical health of individuals or the economy or people losing their housing. And so my hope is that we are paying attention to that and building those robust systems so that we don't see that impact. I hope that we continue to lead with compassion in all of these efforts, that we've built a lot of momentum and we need to continue and grow. And what happened in 2020 and before, that's the past. Like, we can never go back to where we were, whether it's with racial inequities, whether it's with homelessness, whether it's with economic disparities. We can never go back. And so let's look forward to the future and make ourselves even better.
Great. And Alicia.
Yes, I'm going to stay with my hopes. I hope we don't see more Breonna Taylors and George Floyd's. I hope that we remember the pain of seeing George Floyd die. And I hope that we continue to remain vigilant and stand up for the voiceless. I believe that this time has changed us in some way, and I hope we keep leaning in to the discomfort. I hope we continue to lean into kindness and love and forgiveness, because this time, I think, has made us all really begin to appreciate each other more. And I hope we see that. I truly do.
Wow. Well, I want to thank you guys so much. I tell you, it's hard work that all of us are doing and stuff, but we gain so much knowledge about what you guys think and your thoughts and moving forward. I want to let you know that Bobby chimed in and thanked everybody, Bobby Watts, and a judge and a couple advocates. You guys are pretty popular out there. They know who you are and are watching. So I can't tell you how much we appreciate that you taking the time and the effort to do the videos. I know you're super busy. So once again, thank you and be safe, and we'll keep working on it. Thanks a lot, you guys.
Thank you.
And so that's the end of our section here. And up next, we are joined by none other than Father Greg Boyle from Homeboy Industries. Please stay tuned for our final session as we close out this event with a message of hope. Thank you all very much. Welcome back, everybody. We're so honored to have our next speaker join us today. Father Gregory Boyle is the founder of Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles, California, the largest gang intervention, rehabilitation, and reentry program in the world. As a Jesuit priest, Father Boyle witnessed the devastating impact of gang violence on his community during the so-called Decade of Death. That began in the late 1980s and peaked at about 1,000 gang-related killings in 1992. In the face of law enforcement tactics and criminal justice policies of suppression and mass incarceration as the means of end gang violence, Father Boyle and parish and community members adopted what was a radical approach at the time, and it was treating gang members as human beings. In 1988, they started what would eventually become Homeboy Industries, which employs and trains former gang members in a range of social enterprises, as well as provides critical services to thousands of men and women who walk through its doors every year seeking a better life. Welcome, Father Boyle. We are so excited to hear your presentation today.
It's an honor to be with you and all of you at the Illumination Foundation. We're kind of similar organizations in as much as we want to stand and accompany and walk with the most vulnerable. And so we imagine a circle of compassion, and then we imagine nobody standing outside that circle. And to that end, what we hope to do, of course, is to inch our way out to the margins, because that's the only way the margins get erased, is if we do that. And so the hope is that we will together figure out a way to stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, and to stand with those whose dignity has been denied and those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And all of us get that exquisite opportunity to be able to stand often enough with the easily despised and the readily left out. We get to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. And we stand with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And of course, the hope is that we will create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. For no kinship, no peace; no kinship, no justice; no kinship, no equality. No matter how singularly focused we may well be on those worthy goals, they actually can't happen. And I suspect that if kinship was our goal, we would no longer be promoting justice, we'd be celebrating it. And so we go to the margins, and all of us are accustomed to bracing ourselves because the world will accuse us of wasting our time out at the margins. And the prophet Jeremiah writes, "In this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." So we go to the margins and we want other voices to get heard. At Homeboy Industries, 15,000 folks a year walk through our doors, and gang members from all over LA County. And they come barricaded behind a wall of shame and disgrace. And the only way to scale those walls is with tenderness. And so then they feel welcome and they feel held, and they are returned to themselves, to the truth of who they are, that they're exactly what God had in mind when God made them. But a safe place is sort of where you begin with homeless and with homies, and where they can feel held. And it's not so much about surviving as the fittest, but thriving as the cherished. Certainly at Homeboy Industries, the men and women who walk through our doors come with a disorganized attachment. You know, mom was either frightened or frightening, and you can't really calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. And so if it's true enough that a traumatized person may well be likely to cause trauma, then it's equally true that a cherished person is more likely to find their way to the joy there is in cherishing themselves and others. The homies always say at our place, you know, we're used to being watched, but we're not used to being seen. And so how do we address this invisibility issue? A homie said to me not long ago, if you see me, I'll always know what I look like. And so we want to somehow tell them and remind them of their truth. The Buddhists always say, "Oh, nobly born, remember who you really are." And so we see people. You don't go to the margins to fix people at the margins or even to make a difference. You go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make you different. I remember there was a homie who was working with gang members in the streets of Houston. And after a talk I gave there, he kind of pleaded with me earnestly. He said, how do you reach them? And I found myself saying, well, for starters, stop trying to reach them. Can you be reached by them? And so you receive who people are while you're seeing them. And suddenly they find their voice because you've held up a mirror and you've returned them to themselves. You know, a couple of years ago, I buried my 92-year-old mother, and she had 8 kids. And I had buried my father 25 years before. And she died just the way everybody would want to die, in your own bed, in your own home, surrounded by your kids. And she was completely sharp till the very end. In fact, in the last year of her life, she watched so much MSNBC, she was becoming Rachel Maddow. And she wasn't a lick afraid of dying. In fact, she said to me once with great exhilaration and giddiness, she says, I've never done this before. It's something you might say just before skydiving. In fact, the day before she died, I was sitting by her bed and I was the only one there, which was rare. And she woke up and she saw me there and she said, oh, for crying out loud. And she went back to sleep. Well, she was pissed off, you know, that she hadn't died yet. Sorry. And so, well, the next day, exactly noon, I was then, you know, alone with her, which was extremely rare. And at exactly noon, she opened up her eyes and she lifted her head and she let out this glorious, wondrous gasp, skydiving. And nobody in earshot of the sound would ever be afraid of death again. But during those last weeks, she would always do this one thing, which was, you know, there'd be 3 or 4 or all 8 of us around her bed, and she'd be in and out of consciousness. And when she came to, she'd look at one of us and she'd lock onto us. And she'd say with breathless delight, you're here. You're here. And of course, there's the singularity of focus that you want to bring to people who come to you, who cross the door and who come burdened and demonized, who have experienced themselves as disposable. And you look them in the eye and you say, oh, nobly born, remember who you really are. You're here. You're here. But at Homeboy, we know that you have to reach in and you have to dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. For indeed, it's true that the principal suffering of the poor throughout history and scripture is shame and disgrace. And so how do you reach in and return people to their truth? There's one line in the Acts of the Apostles, which is kind of telling, and it says simply, and awe came upon everyone. And it suggests that the measure of our health as a community may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. I remember years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia. And, it was one of those things that we call a gang in service. So it was from 9 to 5, and all these social workers commandeered a hotel ballroom. And you get credit and you sign in for it. And, and they have workshops and breakout sessions and keynote talks. And I figured I was going to give a keynote speech, as I had many times before. So I said yes, and I bought my ticket. Well, a week before I was to fly, I pull out the letter, and to my horror, I discover that I am to be the only speaker from 9 to 5 all damn day. And I remember saying to myself, as the homies often say, oh, hell no, I am not going to be the only speaker. So I call in 2 homies trainees, and we have an 18-month training program. And these 2 guys, Andre and Jose, were like in their 9th month of our training program, and both gang members, enemies, rivals, in fact. And I sit them down and I said, look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers, and I'd like you to tell your story. Take your time, because we got a long ass day to fill. Well, I'd never heard their stories, and Jose gets up first, and he's, I suppose, 25 years old at the time, gang member, tattooed, been to prison. At that juncture in his 9th month with us, he had become a very valued member of our substance abuse team, a man solid in his own recovery. And now he was helping younger homies and homegirls with their addiction issues. So not only had he been to prison and was on parole, he also had a long stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. So he gets up in front of 600 social workers and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers audibly gasped. And then he says, it sounds way worser in Spanish. And we got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. And then he continued, I guess I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage. She knocks on the door, and the guy comes to the door, and she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school each day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through, and second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his composure, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. The Christmas carol, O Holy Night, has this one line: long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. And yeah, it's a song about Christmas, and yeah, it's about Jesus. How is it not the job description of each one of us? You appear and the soul feels its worth. Oh, nobly born, you're here. And people feel welcome, and people gain a resilience. And eventually they leave our presence, and the world will throw at them what it will. But this time they won't be toppled by it because they know who they are, because you saw them. In the old days, I used to ride my bike in the housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village, and we had 8 gangs at war with each other. And I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988, and I buried my 238th about 3 weeks ago now. But I would ride my bike in the projects, and I was talking to some homies in kind of an archway in the housing projects. I could see in the parking lot there was this homie named Bandit, and we all called him Bandit. And he was a bandit, and he was a gang member and sold drugs mainly. But there he was. He ran up to a car to sell crack cocaine, and then he was counting his money and walking towards us. I wish I could say he was embarrassed that he saw me straddling my beach cruiser talking to his homies, but he wasn't so much. I handed him my card for the umpteenth time, and he never stepped foot in our office at Homeboy Industries until he did. And I couldn't believe it. Yes, y milagro, I said to him. And he said what gang members often say: I was tired of being tired. And so he began with us, and he was cherished, and he found his way to the joy of cherishing. And he came to terms with what had been done to him, and also with what he had done. And he discovered that if you don't transform your pain, you'll just keep inflicting it. And after 18 months, he was ready to move on. And so we found him gainful employment beyond us. And it was an entry-level warehouse kind of job. And then within 5 years, he was a kind of the supervisor of the whole warehouse. And then a number of years later, he was again elevated and promoted. Bought a home, married his sweetheart, and had 3 kids. And with homies, no news is good news. And I hadn't heard from him for a while. And until one Friday afternoon, many years later, he calls me with kind of a panic in his voice. He says, "Gee, you have to bless my daughter." I said, "¿Qué pasó, mijo? Is she sick? Is she in the hospital?" He said, "Oh, no, no. On Sunday, she's going to Humboldt College. My oldest, my Jessica. But she's only 18. She's a little chaparrita. I don't know. We're scared for her. Do you think you could give her a blessing before she goes?" And I said, "Oh my gosh, I'd be honored." Well, tomorrow's Saturday, and so I have baptisms at 1. Why don't you guys come by at 12:30 and we'll do a little send off? And so Bandit and his wife and the 3 kids, including tiny little Jessica, show up at exactly 12:30. And so I kind of situate her in front of the altar, and I said, "Let's encircle her and everybody touch her. Put your hands on her shoulders, on her arms. Go ahead, put your hands on her head." And I tell all of them to, bow their heads and to close their eyes. And as the homies say, I do a long ass prayer. I go on. And somewhere in the middle of this prayer, I notice that we've all become chillones. We're all crying. I don't know why we're crying, except for the fact that Bandit and his wife don't know anybody who's ever gone to college except me. Certainly nobody in their families. So, I finish the prayer and I wipe my eyes, and we all laugh at how mushy we got. And so to change the subject, I look at little Jessica. I say, "Hey, what are you going to study at Humboldt College?" And she was very quick, "Forensic psychology." And I go, "Damn, forensic psychology." And Bandit over here chimes in, "Yeah, she wants to study the criminal mind." And Jessica looks at her father and she does one of these, and he sees her and laughs and says, "Yeah, I'm going to be her first subject." So we go out to the car and big abrazos, and everybody piles into the car, but Bandit hangs back, and I'm glad he has. And I said, "Hey, can I tell you something? I give you credit for the man you've chosen to become, for choosing to walk in your own footsteps. I'm proud of you." And his eyes well up with tears. And he looks at me and he says, "You know what? I'm proud of myself. All my life, people called me a lowlife, a bueno para nada, a good for nothing. I guess I showed them." I said, "Yeah, I guess you did." And the soul feels its worth. Exactly right. We go to the margins and we try to imagine something different. We imagine a circle of compassion, and then we imagine nobody standing outside that circle. And that's how the cycle gets broken. You stand at the margins and you look under your feet, and you discover that the margins are getting erased because you chose to put yourself in that vicinity. For no kinship, no peace, no kinship, no justice, no kinship, no equality. You don't go to the margins to make a difference. You go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make you different. And then and only then do we enter into some exquisite mutuality where we are all inhabiting our dignity, our nobility. And we look into each other's eyes and we can say, "Oh, nobly born, remember who you really are. You're here. You're here." And before too long, we all cease to care whether anyone accuses us of wasting our time at the margins. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Boyle. Again, just so inspired, hearing your words and the work you do. And I know you started out by saying that there is a lot of parallels and we overlap in the work we do. My first question is, we've been doing this, obviously not as long as you, the last 15 years, working in the streets up in LA, Orange County, Inland Empire. I wonder how you really address, NIMBYism. We thought, at first we were seeing a change in the tide, and obviously homelessness, a lot of the clients that are in our reentry program were homeless. I know you face that a lot, but how have you addressed that in the last years?
Yeah, I think the aerial view really on that is Mother Teresa used to say that the problem in the world is that we've forgotten that we belong to each other. So the more we can get as a society to the notion that we in fact belong to each other and that there's nobody who's outside that belonging, nobody, and that inclusion is kind of the highest imaginable goal. So if we take inclusion seriously, then we'll be at another place in terms of addressing these vexing social dilemma. But I think also part of it is, we tend to get into this place and mindset that wants to deliver services, which is what we do at Homeboy Industries, but it's so secondary to creating a community of kinship, because you can't really deliver services unless people feel safe, unless people have a palpable sense of being welcomed. And then they come in and they breathe easier, and then they begin to breathe differently. And so the more we can invite the larger population into a philosophical, spiritual even sense of belonging. So you want to create a community of beloved belonging that tries to address severed belonging, where people have felt cut off from their even liveliness. And so that gets restored if you can create a culture of cherishing and tenderness, which is like the highest form of spiritual maturity. I think people want to be invited to that level of connection. It's just, we need to figure out how to do the inviting that in a way that's more compelling.
Yeah, great. It's such a unique time for us in the fact that 2020 was something that no one anticipated or experiencing. I know today our audience has a lot of nonprofit leaders, and prior to 2020, it was difficult and continues to be difficult to run and manage a nonprofit. I have to say, you probably don't know this, but we're unique in the fact that we run a social enterprise, and we generate a lot of our income and budget from our recuperative care program that helps all the other programs. That was a little bit modeled off Homeboys Industries, and I saw the work that you were all doing up there, and went up there and thought, this is what we're going to have to do to survive and make it sustainable. What would you say to the nonprofits that now, 2021 could look really bleak, and the fact that funding is going to be really tight. How were you inspired to think of, just starting Homeboy Industries? That's the first part. And then the second question, part B, and I loved, because I heard you talked about your plumbing, your offshoot of plumbing, and we did the same thing, because not everything worked. And but I laughed so hard when you talked about your plumbing part of Homeboy Industries, and how not everything works. And so when nonprofits ask us, how did you guys get to where you're at today? I tell them, it's trial and error. And again, when I heard you talk about that, I really just cracked up, because I was thinking to myself, yeah, we did a few of those ourselves. So can you share both that with us? Both
Yeah,
those questions?
so we were started a long time ago in the projects, and we started a school, and then we started a jobs program trying to find felony friendly employers, and then that wasn't so forthcoming. So we started kind of crews, maintenance crew, landscaping crew, graffiti removal crew, and then we started Homeboy Bakery, and then Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market. And you're referring to the fact that not everything worked, and we started Homeboy Plumbing, and that was not hugely successful. So, but part of the thing, those were different times. I mean, the demonizing was writ large for gang members, and we're not so much a tough on crime society as we are a smart on crime. So the transformation in 32 years is that people started to see, oh, this is smart. And if they're given the choice between smart and soft, I mean, a tough and soft, they're gonna pick tough. But if your choice really is tough or smart, everybody's gonna pick smart. So we're in a different place now, oddly, even with the pandemic, and I would say, the racial reckoning that began with the murder of George Floyd, is that what's happened is that people, it's touched into, I think, a very magnanimous spirit, and people are generous. So I'm sometimes I'm hopeful and sometimes I'm optimistic, but I'm oddly both at the moment, because I find that people are quite generous. So you get to a point, once you feel like you have more than you need, people decide to build a longer table rather than a higher wall. And I think that really has happened. So I know it's we'd have every reason to be anxious about what 2021 is going to bring. But I have this feeling that, oddly, this is one of the things that calls us to remember that we belong to each other. So even NIMBYism back in the day, may be different in 2021, where people go, no, we need to watch out for each other, and we need to stand with each other, but especially the most vulnerable and those on the margins.
Great. We have a question from one of our audience members, and I'll kind of rephrase it for you here, but it's basically, one of the biggest misconception about the population you work with is that they're going to be violent. And this question comes in as the individual wants to work and volunteer with the reentry program, but is afraid. How would you, I'm sure you're not going to just walk up to somebody. It is intimidating. Tattoos, they don't look like you. They know they have a criminal record. How would you help ease that person's mind that, they made a mistake, or they're just like you and I?
Well, I mean, part of the thing at Homeboy is, in the old days, you would say, an educated inmate may not reoffend, or you might say an employed one may not reoffend. But what we discovered probably 15 years ago is that a healed inmate or gang member won't ever go back to prison. And that's our absolute guarantee. So that's our investment now, is really in healing. And it's the relationship that heals. And how do you get folks to a place of relational wholeness with each other? So it's not like they walk out of the doors of prison and their employers there, saying, hey, I got a job for you. And in the early days of Homeboy, it was nothing stops the bullet like a job. But then we discovered, yeah, but if there is no healing, it doesn't last very long. And so Homeboy is sort of a seal of good housekeeping. It's like, you can know that after 18 months that the folks who've come through our place anyway, have come to terms with what was done to them and what they've done. And though obviously healing will end in the graveyard for all of us, but if you surrender to some kind of foundational essential healing, which is the 18 months, and our 18-month program kind of parallels the 18 months that it takes for a newborn to attach to the caregiver. So it's kind of a parallel to that, where severed belonging gets addressed and people are attaching again, and then they're resilient, and these are going to be good workers. So, but a lot of the problem comes in our minds, but once you go to the vicinity and get proximate, and once you kind of show up, and then you discover that folks are just like you, that we were all born wanting the same things, and then you make that discovery, and it changes the equation.
Great. One of the audience sent in, thank you for the incredible stories you shared. How does what you do combine with education and trauma for a lot of the clients you see? I think they mean, in other words, are you seeing a lot of the clients that come into Homeboy's industry, has trauma affected them, obviously, but the lack of education, is that part of what you're seeing as one of the biggest factors that's leading them to prison?
Yeah, so obviously we have a lot of education is something we insist that everybody, no matter where they are, even if they can't read, that they're engaged in some kind of advancement in terms of their own education. But so they have the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experience study, and it, what were kids exposed to, anybody under 18, and there are 10 things that you check off, and 5 are personal and 5 are environmental. And from a parent being locked up, or a drug addict, or physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, there are 10 things. So experts say if you're a 4 or 5 on the ACEs, you're going to have health issues and socializing difficulties if you're a 4 or 5. I'm a 0 on the ACEs, which says more about my own white privilege and the fact that I won, the parent lottery, the education lottery, the neighborhood zip code sibling lottery. I won all these lotteries. But every man or woman who walks through our doors at Homeboy is a 9 or a 10 on the ACEs, which is astounding. It's so high that you need to stand in awe at what they've had to carry rather than in judgment. And so healing is essential. Healing happens in a culture of tenderness, but it also happens, in groups. It happens with therapy. Everybody's in therapy. And it's hard to do that work. But it's essential, so so we're a trauma-informed, obviously, community. And so people need to find their way clear to transform their pain, otherwise they keep inflicting it. And that's kind of an essential tenet of Homeboy Industries.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned ACEs because we're obviously involved a lot. We have therapists, and our children, a lot of the ones we work with are 10 and 11 on that scale. And we have an incredible Dr. Gita Grover working with them. Again, there's, the outcome could be prison. Like you said, it could be homeless on the street and death if those aren't addressed. So thank you for addressing those. They're so important. This question comes from the Diocese of Orange. Spirituality has played a huge role in your work. How has spirituality impacted the individuals you work with? And have you seen an increase in their spiritual health and understanding?
Yeah, well, the whole thing is soaked with spirit, and I would say that part of. I remember once somebody told me that they wanted to become more spiritual, and I think, why would you settle for spiritual when what we're being invited to is wholeness? And so at Homeboy, we talk about therapeutic mysticism, which is seeing the whole person, which is how a mystic sees people, which the goal, of course, is how do you see as God does. And so, and it really has impact on how we operate, because we don't get tripped up by behavior. Somebody colors outside the lines. I mean, it's like gang violence itself. We know that it's about something else. And so we want to ask ourselves, what language is that violence speaking? And then you can get, a homie said to me not long ago, God is able to find the thorn underneath. And that's the invitation. How do we find the thorn underneath rather than get tripped up by, behavior that's kind of outside? And so it's not so much like religion. God knows, you have atheists and you have Buddhists and you have Muslims and you have Catholics and you have, Christians. And so it's not a sense of proselytizing, but it really is a sense of the wholeness, the therapeutic mysticism that undergirds everything that we do. If you see wholeness in people, they're going to see wholeness in each other. And if they know their hearts, then they will see the heart of the other. And that's the depth of spirituality anyway, which is, again, as I mentioned earlier, that tenderness is the highest form of spiritual maturity. So if you can be tender with people, then you that's how you operate, and that's how you receive people, and that's how you allow your hearts to be altered by the other, rather than draw the lines and become tribal and cut people off. So it's not about us and them, it's just us, which can only be nurtured and fostered and like a petri dish kind of culture that grows from tenderness and cherishing each other, which is what spirituality always hopes to be.
Wow. Thank you for that. I've ate your tortillas. I've ate at your restaurants at the airport. I love the restaurant, and I tell you, that was some of the best service that I've had. What is next for Homeboys Industries? Are you thinking, are you going to scale up, build more programs, intensify the program? What are your thoughts moving
Yeah, well,
forward?
we're always kind of scaling up, and because we've been around for so long, everybody knows where we are, and so we're kind of we're a one-stop shop, but we're also the first stop. In fact, our proximity to Men's Central Jail often, is within minutes after their release, they're at our place. But 70% of all gang members are, by definition, homeless, and our folks are certainly in that category. So, you know, they're living in a car, they're couch surfing, it's insecure. So our next frontier is we want to build transitional housing and permanent housing kind of on properties near us. And so we're just beginning to kind of get that going. So, but that's a huge need for our population.
Yeah. Yeah, we definitely echo that because as you heard, and probably the last couple days speakers on homelessness, it all starts and ends with housing, healthcare, and you know, reentry programs. So love to definitely partner with you on that. And I have two final questions. Number one is, I know there's been, you know, obviously a change in administration. If you could sit down with President-elect Biden and President-elect Harris, what would it be that you would tell them to work on first?
Well, I mean, everything is about you know, it's about something else, and so find the something else. So we always pat ourselves on the back because we want to address something head on, but it's never head on. You know, it's you know, if you can address uh, despair and trauma and heal trauma, and if you can, you know, address mental health issues, you know, and all of a sudden watch what happens. You know, if you can address equity and access to those things that enhance the quality of our lives, from healthcare, you know, to job opportunities and education, watch what happens. So all these things are interconnected, but they're large, you know, but we always think there's this one thing. We will solve racism this way. We will solve gang violence this way. And then it's not a very large view. And we suffer because we're not that sophisticated about these things, or that our diagnoses are so bad. Nobody's ever met a bad diagnosis that led to a good treatment plan. It's just never happened. And so you want to make sure you understand that we understand what is this about, and what language is it speaking, and maybe it's about something else. So find the something else, which would be my invitation to the next administration.
Wow, great advice. And so the final question that we have for you, and we're asking all of our speakers, it has been such a tough 2020 year for us, relatively speaking. But going on to 2021, what do you feel is the hope, prayer, wishes, and what do you think will we have to work on going forward in 2021?
Yeah, I think we have been given, you know, 2020 vision, you know, if you will, that somehow this period has really shown us something, that we need to imagine a new social contract, and we're in this together, and you know, we learned it the hard way in a sense, you know, through uh, you know, we were all hit by the same storm, but we realized that we were weathering the storm in different sized vessels, you know, in a steamer and a yacht or a inner tube, or even folks are clinging to a piece of driftwood. It's the same storm, but we're weathering it with different sized vessels. And so now I think we're at a point where we see that, and where we want to change that. And I just feel like somehow this 2020 vision that we're going to carry into 2021 will remind us always of our unshakable goodness as human beings, and will remind us of our own magnanimous, generous spirit that I think has really shown itself during this time. So whereas it began with hoarding of toilet paper and hand sanitizer, that's old news. You know, it's really issued now I think, in a sense of real kinship and connection and belonging. And that's what we long for. And hopefully we'll continue to walk in that direction.
Wow. Well, on behalf of Illumination Foundation and all the clients, the thousands of clients we're serving, I want to thank you so much for the incredible work you do, the hope, and just the spirit of helping. And I think that leads us after 3 days on a good hope to forge forward. So thank you so much, and be safe. And I hope to see you in person soon, not via video. But thank you very much.
Sure.
And so that concludes this year's consortium. Everyone here at Illumination Foundation is blown away by the discussions from this year's speakers and insights they have provided. The policymakers, the expert leaders, the providers, activists you've heard this week have been the forefront of a year that has challenged all the systems like none other before, our communities and ourselves. They have illuminated the ways that vulnerable populations are affected by economic, social, and health policies. They have demonstrated the vast inequalities and disparities that exist on how these contribute to the growing number of homeless and vulnerable populations. But we have seen this week there is hope, and you heard from many of our speakers and Father Boyle that after facing this year's challenges, that our organizations, our agencies, and companies are better equipped to mobilize resources, shore up our infrastructure, and address these glaring inequalities that exist. We have seen how public-private nonprofit partnerships have continued to grow together to have to solve these social problems. We have seen innovative solutions that are possible, and I'm inspired by the hopefulness of the speakers when they were talking about 2021, with the promise that not only the vaccine is close, but that we've learned from this past year to work together and to show kindness to each other. Someone reminded me the other day back to World War II that our society and our citizens had 4 years of suffering, of quarantines, of doing without. And so now 8 and 9 months into this pandemic, we are hopefully seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. But we hope we brought together some good ideas, and we hope that we've inspired you just a little, that 2021 will be a better and blessed year moving forward. So to all of you, have a happy and safe holiday. We look forward to seeing you soon. And again, we want to thank all the speakers, our sponsors. We're hopeful that you will join us. And on behalf of every employee at Illumination Foundation, our board, and all the hundreds of thousands of clients that we serve, thank you and God bless.